David anointed king. Beauty and talent, Adam's gifts to David, did not shield their possessor against hardship. As the supposed son of a slave, he was banished from association with his brothers, and his days were passed in the desert tending his father's sheep. It was his shepherd life that prepared him for his later exalted position. With gentle consideration, he led the flocks. The young lambs he guided to pastures of tender grass, the patches of less juicy herbs he reserved for the sheep, and the full-grown sturdy rams were given the tough weeds for food. Then God said, "David knows how to tend sheep, therefore he shall be shepherd of my flock Israel." In the solitude of the desert, David had opportunities of displaying his extraordinary physical strength. One day he slew 4 lions and 3 bears, though he had no weapons. His most serious adventure was with the reem. David encountered the mammoth asleep, and taking it for a mountain, he began to ascend it. Suddenly the reem awoke, and David found himself high up in the air on its horns. He vowed, if he were rescued, to build a temple to God 100 ells in height, as high as the horns of the reem. Then God sent a lion. The king of beasts inspired the reem with awe and curiosity, and he bowed down to investigate, and David could easily descend from his perch. At that moment, a deer appeared. The lion pursued after the deer, and David was saved from both the lion and the reem. He continued to lead the life of a shepherd until at the age of 28 he was anointed king by Samuel, who was taught by a special revelation that the despised youngest son of Jesse was to be king. Samuel's first charge had been to anoint one of the sons of Jesse, but he was not told which one. When he saw the oldest, Eliab, he thought that he was the king of God's choice. God had allowed him to be deceived in order to punish Samuel for his excessive self-confidence in calling himself the seer. It was thus proved to him that he could not see everything. However, Samuel's error was pardonable. God's first choice had rested on Eliab. Only on account of his violent nature, his swiftness to anger against David, the position destined for him was transferred to his younger brother. Eliab was in a sense compensated by seeing his daughter become the wife of Rehoboam. Thus he too enjoys the distinction of being among the ancestors of the Judaic kings. So Samuel's vision of Eliab as king was not wholly false. The election of David was obvious from what happened with the holy oil with which he was anointed. When Samuel tried to pour the oil on David's brothers, it had remained in the horn. But at David's appearance, it flowed of its own accord and poured itself over him. The drops on his garment changed into diamonds and pearls, and after the act of anointing him, the horn was as full as before. The amazement was great that the son of a slave should be made king. Then the wife of Jesse revealed her secret and declared herself the mother of David. The anointing of David was for a time kept secret, but its effect appeared in the gift of prophecy, which manifested itself in David, and in his extraordinary spiritual development. His new accomplishments naturally earned envy for him. None was more bitterly jealous than Doeg, the greatest scholar of his time. When he heard that Saul was about to have David come to court as his attendant, Doeg began to praise David excessively, with the purpose of arousing the king's jealousy and making David hateful in his eyes. He succeeded, yet Saul did not relinquish his plan of having David at court. David had become known to Saul in his youth, and at that time the king had conceived great admiration for him. The occasion was one on which David had shown cleverness as well as love of justice. A rich woman had to leave her home temporarily. She could not carry her fortune with her, nor did she wish to entrust it to anyone else. She adopted the device of hiding her gold in honey jars, and these she deposited with a neighbor. Accidentally, he discovered what was in the jars, and he took the gold. On her return, the woman received her vessels, but the gold concealed in them was gone. Since she had no real evidence to bring up against her faithless neighbor, the court dismissed her complaint. She appealed to the king, but he was equally powerless to help. When the woman came out of the palace, David was amusing himself with his companions. Seeing her dejection, he demanded an audience with the king, that truth might prevail. The king authorized him to do as he saw fit. David ordered the honey jars to be broken, and 2 coins were found adhering to the inner side of the vessels. The thief had overlooked them, and they proved his dishonesty. The encounter with Goliath. David was not long permitted to enjoy the ease of life at court. The aggressive manner assumed by Goliath drove him to the front. It was a curious chance that designated David to be the slayer of Goliath, who was allied with him by ties of blood. Goliath, it will be remembered, was the son of the Moabitess Orpah, the sister-in-law of David's ancestress Ruth. David and Goliath differed as widely as their grandmothers, for in contrast to Ruth, the pious, religious woman, Orpah had led a life of unspeakable infamy. Her son Goliath was jeered at as the son of 100 fathers and 1 mother. But God lets nothing go unrewarded, even in the wicked. In return for the 40 steps Orpah had accompanied her mother-in-law, Naomi, Goliath the Philistine, her son, was permitted to display his strength and skill on 40 different days. And in return for the 4 tears, she was privileged to give birth to 4 giant sons. Of the 4, Goliath was the strongest and greatest. What the scriptures tell about him is but a small fraction of what might have been told. The scriptures refrain intentionally from expiating the prowess of the miscreant, nor do they tell how Goliath, impious as he was, dared challenge the God of Israel to combat with him, and how he tried by every means in his power to hinder the Israelites in their divine worship. Morning and evening he would appear in the camp at the very time when the Israelites were preparing to say the Shema. All the more cause, then, for David to hate Goliath and determine to annihilate him. His father encouraged him to oppose Goliath, for he considered it David's duty to protect Saul the Benjamite against the giant, as Judah, his ancestor, had in ancient days pledged himself for the safety of Benjamin, the ancestor of Saul, for Goliath was intent on doing away with Saul. His grievance against him was that once, when in a skirmish between the Philistines and the Israelites, Goliath had succeeded in capturing the holy tables of the law, Saul had wrested them from the giant. But now, in consequence of his malady, Saul could not venture to cross swords with Goliath, and he accepted David's offer to enter into the combat in his place. David put on Saul's armor, and when it appeared that the armor of the powerfully built king fit the slender youth, Saul recognized that David had been predestined for the serious task. But at the same time, David's miraculous transformation did not fail to arouse his jealousy. David, for that reason, declined to array himself as a warrior for his battle with Goliath. He wanted to meet him as a simple shepherd. 5 pebbles came to David of their own accord, and when he touched them, they all turned into 1 pebble. The 5 pebbles stood for God, the 3 patriarchs, and Aaron. Hophni and Phinehas, the descendants of the last, had only a short time before been killed by Goliath. Scarcely did David begin to move toward Goliath when the giant became conscious of the magic power of the youth. The evil eye David cast on his opponent sufficed to afflict him with leprosy, and in the very same instant he was rooted to the ground, unable to move. Goliath was so confused by his predicament that he scarcely knew what he was saying, and he uttered the foolish threat that he would give David's flesh to the cattle of the field, as though cattle ate flesh. One can see, David said to himself, that he is crazy, and there can be no doubt he is doomed. Sure of victory, David retorted that he would cast the carcass of the Philistine to the fowls of the air. At the mention of the fowls, Goliath raised his eyes skyward to see whether there were any birds about. The upward motion of his head pushed his visor slightly away from his forehead, and in that instant the pebble aimed by David struck him on the exposed spot. An angel descended and cast him to the ground, face downward, so that the mouth that had blasphemed God might be choked with earth. He fell in such a way that the image of Dagon, which he wore on his breast, touched the ground, and his head came to lie between the feet of David, who now had no difficulty in dispatching him. Goliath was encased from top to toe in several suits of armor, and David did not know how to remove them and cut off the head of the giant. At this juncture, Uriah the Hittite offered him his services, but only under the condition that David secure him an Israelite wife. David accepted the condition, and Uriah in turn showed him how the various suits of armor were fastened together at the heels of the giant's feet. David's victory naturally added fuel to the fire of Saul's jealousy. Saul sent Abner, his general, to make inquiries whether David, who he knew was of the tribe of Judah, belonged to the clan of Perez or to the clan of Zerah. In the former case, his suspicion that David was destined for kingship would be confirmed. Doeg, David's enemy, observed that David, being the descendant of the Moabitess Ruth, did not even belong to the Jewish communion, and Saul need entertain no fears from that quarter. A lively discussion arose between Abner and Doeg as to whether the law in Deuteronomy regarding Moabites affected women as well as men. Doeg, an expert dialectician, brilliantly refuted all of Abner's arguments in favor of the admission of the Moabite women. Samuel's authority had to be appealed in order to establish for all times the correctness of Abner's view. Indeed, the dispute could be settled only by recourse to threats of violence. Ithra, the father of Amasa, in Arab fashion, for which he was sometimes called the Ishmaelite, threatened to hew down anyone with his sword who refused to accept Samuel's interpretation of the law, that male Moabites and male Ammonites are forever excluded from the congregation of Israel, but not Moabite and Ammonite women. Pursued by Saul. As God stood by David in his duel with Goliath, so he stood by him in many other of his difficulties. Often, when he thought all hope lost, the arm of God suddenly favored him, and in unexpected ways, not only bringing relief, but also conveying instruction on God's wise and just guidance of the world. David once said to God, "The world is entirely beautiful and good, with the one exception of insanity. What use does the world derive from a lunatic who runs hither and thither, tears his clothes, and is pursued by a mob of hooting children?" "Verily, a time will come," said God, "when you will supplicate me to afflict you with madness." Now it happened when David, on his flight before Saul, came to Achish, the king of the Philistines, who lived in Gath, that the brothers of Goliath formed the heathen king's bodyguard, and they demanded that their brother's murderer be executed by Achish. Achish, though a heathen, was pious, for which reason he is called Abimelech in the Psalms, after the king of Gerar, who was also noted for piety. He therefore sought to pacify David's enemies. He called their attention to the fact that Goliath had been the one to challenge the Jews, and it was proper, therefore, that he should be left to bear the consequences. The brothers, however, rejoined that if that view prevailed, then Achish would have to give up his throne to David, for, according to the conditions of the combat, the victor was to have dominion over the vanquished, as his servants. In his distress, David besought God to let him appear a madman in the eyes of Achish and his court. God granted the prayer. As the wife and daughter of the Philistine king were both bereft of reason, we can understand his exclamation, "Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my court?" Thus it was that David was rescued. Then he composed the psalm beginning with the words, "I will bless the Lord at all times," which includes even the time of lunacy. On another occasion, David expressed his doubt of God's wisdom in having formed such apparently useless creatures as spiders. They do nothing but spin a web that has no value. He was to have proof that even a spider's web may serve an important purpose. Similarly, when David became indebted to a wasp for his life, he was cured of his scorn for them. He had thought them good for nothing but to breed maggots. David once surprised Saul and his attendants while they were fast asleep in their camp, and he resolved to carry off, as proof of his magnanimity, the pot that stood between the feet of the giant Abner, who, like the rest, was sleeping. Fortunately, his knees were drawn up so that David could carry out his intention unhindered. But as David was leaving with the pot, Abner stretched out his feet and pinned down David as with two solid pillars. His life would have been forfeit if a wasp had not stung Abner, who, mechanically in his sleep, moved his feet and released David. There were still other miracles that happened for David in his flight. Once, when Saul and his men surrounded David, an angel appeared and summoned him home to repulse a raid of the Philistines. Saul gave up the pursuit of David, but only after a majority had so decided, for some of them were of the opinion that the seizure of David was quite as important as repulsing the Philistines. Again, in his battle with the Amalekites, David enjoyed direct intervention from above. Lightning, in flashes and sheets, illuminated the dark night, so enabling him to carry on the struggle. Wars. David's first thought after ascending the throne was to take Jerusalem, sacred since the days of Adam, Noah, and Abraham, from the grasp of the heathen. The plan was not easy for various reasons. The Jebusites, the possessors of Jerusalem, were the prosperity of those sons of Heth, who had ceded the cave of Machpelah to Abraham only on the condition that their descendants should never be forcibly dispossessed of their city, Jerusalem. In perpetuation of this agreement between Abraham and the sons of Heth, monuments of brass were erected, and when David approached Jerusalem with hostile intent, the Jebusites pointed to Abraham's promise, engraved on them and still plainly to be read. They maintained that before David could take the city, which they had surrounded with a high wall, he would have to destroy the monuments. Joab devised a plan of getting into Jerusalem. He set up a tall cypress tree near the wall, bent it downward, and standing on David's head, he grasped the very tip of the tree. When the tree rebounded, Joab sat high above the wall and could jump down on it. Once in the city, he destroyed the monuments and possessed himself of Jerusalem. For David, a miracle had happened. The wall had lowered itself before him that he could walk right into the city without difficulty. David, however, was not desirous of using forcible means. He therefore offered the Jebusites 600 shekels, 50 shekels for each Israelite tribe. The Jebusites accepted the money and gave David a bill of sale. Jerusalem having been acquired, David had to prepare for war with the Philistines, in which he gave proof at once of his heroic courage and his unshakable trust in God. The latter quality he displayed in the battle that took place in the Valley of the Giants. God had commanded David not to attack the host of the Philistines until he heard the sound of marching in the tops of the mulberry trees. God wanted to pass judgment on the angels of the heathen before surrendering the heathen themselves to the pious, and the motion at the tops of the trees was to indicate that the battle could proceed. The enemy advanced until there were but 4 ells between them and the Israelites. The latter were about to throw themselves against the Philistines, but David restrained them, saying, "God forbid me to attack the Philistines before the top of the trees begin to move. If we transgress God's command, we shall certainly die. If we delay, it is possible that we should be killed by the Philistines, but at least we shall die as pious men that keep God's command. Above all, let us have confidence in God." Scarcely had he ended his speech when the tops of the trees rustled, and David made a successful assault on the Philistines. Whereon God said to the angels, who were constantly questioning him as to why he had taken the kingship from Saul and given it to David, "See the difference between Saul and David?" Of David's other campaigns, the most notable was his war with Shobach, the Aramean, who he conquered in spite of his gigantic size and strength. Shobach was very tall, and one look at him sufficed to strike terror in the heart of the beholder. The Aramean general indulged in the belief that David would treat the Syrians gently, on account of the monument still in existence at that time, which Jacob and Laban had erected on the frontier between Palestine and Aram, as a sign of their covenant that neither they nor their descendants should wage war with each other. But David destroyed the monument. Similarly, the Philistines had placed trust in a relic from Isaac, the bridle of a mule which the patriarch had given to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, as a pledge of the covenant between Israel and his people. David took it from them by force. However, David was just as he was bold. Disregard of the covenants made by the patriarchs was far removed from his thoughts. Indeed, before departing for the wars with the Arameans and the Philistines, he had charged the Sanhedrin to investigate the claims of the two nations. The claims of the Philistines were shown to be utterly unfounded. In no sense were they the descendants of those Philistines who had concluded a treaty with Isaac. They had emigrated from Cyprus at a much later date. The Arameans, on the other hand, had forfeited their claims on considerate treatment because, under the Aramean Balaam, and later again in the time of Othniel, they had attacked and made war on the Israelites. Ahithophel. Among David's courtiers and attendants, a prominent place is occupied by his counselor, Ahithophel, with whom King David was connected by family ties, Bathsheba being his granddaughter. Ahithophel's wisdom was supernatural, for his counsels always coincided with the oracles rendered by the Urim and Thummim. And great as his wisdom was, it was equaled by his scholarship. Therefore, David did not hesitate to submit himself to his instruction, even though Ahithophel was a very young man, and at the time of his death not more than 33 years old. The one thing lacking in him was sincere piety, and this proved his undoing in the end, for it induced him to take part in Absalom's rebellion against David. Thus he forfeited even his share in the world to come. To this dire course of action he was misled by astrologic and other signs, which he interpreted as prophecies of his own kingship, when in reality they pointed to the royal destiny of his granddaughter, Bathsheba. Possessed by this erroneous belief, he cunningly urged Absalom to commit an unheard-of crime. Thus, Absalom would profit nothing by his rebellion, for though he accomplished his father's ruin, he would yet be held to account and condemned to death for his violation of family purity, and the way of the throne would be clear for Ahithophel, the great sage in Israel. The relationship between David and Ahithophel had been somewhat strained even before Absalom's rebellion. Ahithophel's feelings had been hurt by his being passed over at the time when David, shortly after ascending the throne, invested no less than 90,000 functionaries with positions. On that day a remarkable incident occurred. When the ark was to be brought up from Geba to Jerusalem, the priests who attempted to take hold of it were raised up in the air and thrown violently to the ground. In his despair, the king turned for advice to Ahithophel, who retorted mockingly, "Ask your wise men who you just installed in office." It was only when David uttered a curse on him who knows a remedy and withholds it from the sufferer that Ahithophel advised that a sacrifice should be offered at every step taken by the priests. Although the measure proved efficacious and no further disaster occurred in connection with the ark, yet Ahithophel's words had been insincere. He knew the real reason of the misadventure and concealed it from the king. Instead of following the law of having the ark carried on the shoulders of priests, David had put it on a wagon, and so incurred the wrath of God. Ahithophel's hostility toward David showed itself also on the following occasion. When David was digging the foundations of the temple, a shard was found at a depth of 1,500 cubits. David was about to lift it when the shard exclaimed, "You cannot do it." "Why not?" asked David. "Because I rest on the abyss." "Since when?" "Since the hour in which the voice of God was heard to utter the words from Sinai, 'I am the Lord your God,' causing the earth to quake and sink into the abyss. I lie here to cover up the abyss." Nevertheless, David lifted up the shard, and the waters of the abyss rose and threatened to flood the earth. Ahithophel was standing by, and he thought to himself, "Now David will meet his death, and I shall be king." Just then David said, "Whoever knows how to stem the tide of the waters and fails to do it will one day throttle himself in regret." Then Ahithophel had the name of God inscribed on the shard, and the shard thrown into the abyss. The waters at once commenced to subside, but they sank to so great a depth that David feared the earth might lose her moisture, and he began to sing the 15 songs of ascent to bring the waters up again. Nevertheless, David's curse was realized. Ahithophel ended his days by hanging himself. His last will contained the following 3 rules of conduct. 1. Refrain from doing anything against a favorite of God. 2. Take heed not to rise up against the royal house of David. And 3. If the feast of Pentecost falls on a sunny day, then sow wheat. Posterity has been favored with the knowledge of only a small part of Ahithophel's wisdom. and that little bit through two widely different sources, through Socrates, who was his disciple, and through a fortune book written by him. Joab. Joab, the warrior, was a contrast to Ahithophel in every essential. He was David's right hand. It was said, if Joab had not been there to conduct the wars, David would not have had the leisure to devote himself to the study of the Torah. He was the model of a true Jewish hero, distinguished at the same time for his learning, piety, and goodness. His house stood wide open for all comers, and the campaigns which he undertook rebounded invariably to the benefit of the people, even luxuries. And more than that, he was concerned about the welfare of the scholars, he himself being the president of the Sanhedrin. It interested Joab to analyze the character of men and their opinions. When he heard King David's words, "Like a father who pities his children, so the Lord pities those that fear him," Joab expressed his astonishment that the comparison should be made with the love of a father for a child, and not the love of a mother, mother love as a rule being considered the stronger and more self-sacrificing. He made up his mind to keep his eyes open and observe whether David's idea was borne out by facts. On one of his journeys he happened into the house of a poor old man who had 12 children, all of whom the father supported, however meagerly, with the toil of his own hands. Joab proposed that he sell him one of his 12 children. He would thus be relieved of the care of one, and the selling price could be applied to the better support of the rest. The good father rejected the proposition brusquely. Then Joab approached the mother, offering her 100 golden denarii for one of the children. At first she resisted the temptation, but finally she yielded. When the father returned in the evening, he cut the bread, as he always did, into 14 pieces, for himself, his wife, and his 12 children. In allotting the portions he missed a child and insisted on being told of its fate. The mother confessed what had happened during his absence. The father neither ate nor drank, and next morning he set out, firmly resolved to return the money to Joab, or to slay him if he should refuse to surrender the child. After much haggling, and after the father had threatened him with death, Joab yielded the child to the old man with the exclamation, "Yes, David was right when he compared God's love for men to a father's love for his child. This poor fellow, who has 12 children to support, was prepared to fight me to the death for one of them, which the mother, who calmly stayed at home, had sold me for a price." Among all the heroic achievements of Joab, the most remarkable is the taking of the Amalekite capital. For 6 months, the flower of Israel's army, 12,000 in number, under the leadership of Joab, had been besieging the capital city of the Amalekites without result. The soldiers then made a request to their general that it would be good for them to return home to their wives and children. Joab urged that this would not only earn for them contempt and derision, but would also invite new danger. The heathen would be encouraged to unite against the Israelites. He then proposed that they hurl him into the city by means of a sling, and then wait 40 days. If at the end of this period they saw blood flow from the gates of the fortress, it would be a sign to them that he was still alive. His plan was executed. Joab took with him 1,000 pieces of money and his sword. When he was cast from the sling, he fell into the courtyard of a widow whose daughter attended him. In a little while he regained consciousness. He pretended to be an Amalekite, taken prisoner by the Israelites and thrown into the city by his captors, who had hoped to kill him by doing so. As he was provided with money, which he dispensed lavishly among his nurses, he was received kindly and was given Amalekite clothes. So dressed, he ventured, after 10 days, on a tour of inspection through the city, which he found to be of enormous size. His first errand was to an armorer, to have him mend his sword, which had been broken by the fall. When the artisan scanned Joab's weapon, he stared back. He had never seen a sword like it. He forged a new one, which snapped in two almost at once when Joab grasped it firmly. So it happened with the second sword and with a third. Finally, he succeeded in fashioning one that was acceptable. Joab asked the smith who he would like him to kill with the sword, and the reply was, "Joab, the general of the Israelite king." "I am he," said Joab, and when the smith in astonishment turned to look at him, Joab ran him through so skillfully that the victim had no realization of what was happening. Then he hewed down 500 Amalekite warriors, whom he met on his way, and not one escaped to betray him. The rumor arose that Asmodeus, the king of demons, was waging war among the inhabitants of the city and slaying them in large numbers. After another period of 10 days, which he spent calmly relaxing with his hosts, Joab went forth a second time and caused such bloodshed among the Amalekites that his gory weapon stuck to his hand, and his right hand lost all power of independent motion. It could be made to move only in unison with his arm. He hurried to his lodging place, intending to apply hot water to his hand and free the sword. On his way, the woman who had caught up with him when he fell into the city called to him, "You eat and drink with us, and yet you slay our warriors." Seeing himself betrayed, he could not but kill the woman. Scarcely had his sword touched her when it was separated from his hand, and his hand could move freely. For the dead woman had been with child, and the blood of the unborn babe loosed the sword. After Joab had slain thousands, the Israelites outside the city saw blood issue from the city, at the very moment when they were beginning to mourn their general as dead, and joyfully they cried out with one accord, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Joab, mounted on a high tower, in stentorian tones shouted, "The Lord will not forsake his people." Inspired with high and daring courage, the Israelites demanded permission to assault the city and capture it. As Joab turned to descend from the tower, he noticed that 6 verses of a psalm were inscribed on his foot. The first verse running, "The Lord answers you in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob is your defense." Later, David added 3 verses and completed the psalm. Then the Israelites took the Amalekite capital, destroyed the heathen temples in the city, and slew all its inhabitants, except the king, who, with his crown of pure gold on his head, they brought before David. Next, David's piety and his sin. End part 78 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.